The control chamber of the Zenvar War Council was silent, the kind of silence that only comes when defeat is no longer theoretical, but inevitable. Admiral Vectan's soul gripped the edge of the central command console, his secondary digits twitching against the worn grooves in the surface. The projections were worse than expected. The Dominion's outermost defensive systems were disintegrating under the relentless assaults of the Varkari hegemony, and even their most advanced war simulations had failed to find a single winnable scenario. The hegemony's drones were pouring through contested systems like locusts stripping a field bare, leaving only scorched orbital husks in their wake. The chamber stank of stress. Zenvar stress pheromones were thick in the air, an acrid reminder of the slow death gripping their civilization. Tactician Prime Kordash Vel, a veteran of 100 campaigns, leaned forward, his mandibles clicking together in finality. "They will crush us, Vectan," he said, his voice a deep, guttural scrape that barely concealed his exhaustion. "The numbers are not theory anymore. The bastion line won't hold another standard year. When they breach it, they won't stop at the core worlds. We will not be given the mercy of enslavement. They will purge us." Vectan exhaled slowly, watching the shifting battle reports on the heads-up display. Entire Dominion fleets disintegrated under Varkari bombardments, the formations breaking apart like shattered bone. He knew Kordash was right. For centuries, the war had remained balanced, a perpetual stalemate held by technological advancements countering the Varkari's brutal reproductive efficiency. But the balance had tipped. Now, the Dominion was merely dying slower than projected. A war isn't lost when the last ship falls. It is lost when leaders accept that their fleets were never enough to begin with. Kordash shifted, his upper limbs folding across his chest. "There is only one course left. The humans." Vectan stiffened. "No. They are the only remaining anomaly, the only species the hegemony never fought, and there is a reason for that. Because they are unpredictable, Kordash, uncontained. If we let them into this war, they will end it," Kordash interrupted. The certainty in his voice was unsettling. A murmur rippled through the chamber. For centuries, the Zenvar had observed humanity from a cautious distance. Their rapid evolution, their unpredictable social structures, their refusal to follow any predictable pattern of civilization, the Dominion had deemed them too volatile to integrate into galactic society. Now they were considering opening a door that no one could close. "Do you know what the Council called them in private discussions?" Vectan's voice was quieter now. "A species of uncontained wildfire." Kordash didn't blink. "Good." Across the void, the Varkari hegemony gathered at the precipice of ultimate victory. Warmaster Skorvek Nal stood at the apex of his war chamber, drinking in the scent of conquest. The hive mind war signals hummed through his neural lattice, filling his awareness with the synchronized precision of their final strike formations. The Dominion was gasping its last breaths. The bastion line had fractured in 6 key systems, and reinforcement fleets were obliterated before they could regroup. Victory was no longer an if, but a when. "Prime operative," Skorvek intoned, voice vibrating through the chamber's resonance spires. The walls pulsed in response. The hegemony's technology was as alive as its warriors, linked by shared purpose. An advisor stepped forward, lowering his secondary limbs in submission. "Final directive remains unchanged. We will overrun Zenvar space within 40 cycles. Advance it to 20. The advisor hesitated. Loss projections increase by... It does not matter. Skorvek's voice had no patience for weakness. "The prey is cornered. It is time to finish the hunt." The chamber quivered in agreement. The hive mind pulsed in unison, a rising tide of hunger. 3 light-years away, a small Terran deep space survey team completed its final scans of the Proxima expanse. The crew of the TSS Ulysses was 2 weeks into their routine mission. charting the remains of a collapsed dwarf star. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment. "Atmospheric readings complete," Navigator Calyx Drager announced, leaning back against his console. "Looks like we've got nothing but dead rock in this sector." Captain Eric Kasor didn't bother to respond. His focus remained on the slow-moving star maps cycling through his laser plasma display. Earth had long stopped expecting anything interesting from these deep space surveys. His ship didn't carry weapons. There was no reason to. But something else was in the system with them. Something that had no reason to be there. A Varkari war-cloaked recon ship emerged from FTL on an intercept course. "Contact," Calyx said sharply. His fingers twitched against the panel as he checked the data feed. Wait, that's not ours. It's not even Dominion." A cold weight settled in Kasor's gut. "Varkari," he said. No response came. No transmissions. Just an opening salvo of plasma fire. The Ulysses never had a chance. Its hull blossomed into a violent spray of debris and light, breaking apart before its distress beacon even had time to transmit. And just like that, humanity became part of the war. Zenvar Dominion received the battle report 7 hours later. Vecton's soul studied the wreckage logs, his gaze unmoving as he processed the implications. Kordash Vel said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. It was done. The war had crossed humanity's threshold, and they would respond. For 3 days, the galaxy held its breath. There was no formal communication from Earth's United Coalition defense. No diplomatic summits, no military posturing, just silence. A deep, vast quiet that felt too still. Zenvar analysts speculated that humans had decided to ignore the attack, perhaps viewing it as an accident or recognizing their military irrelevance. But those who knew humanity understood the truth. The absence of reaction was the warning. Then, on the dawn of the 4th day, across every interstellar frequency, humanity finally spoke. A single message. "You wanted us in this war. Congratulations." The Dominion Council chamber fell into stunned silence. Kordash exhaled, mandibles clicking once. "They're not mobilizing fleets," he muttered. "They're mobilizing industry." Vecton clenched his fists. He had feared this moment for decades. Humanity was coming, and they were not here to fight. They were here to end it. A storm of warped space and light rippled over the Dominion's long-range sensor arrays, the kind of gravitational distortion that only came from a massive fleet breaking into real space. Admiral Vecten Sol's mandibles clenched as the data feed flooded the War Council's main chamber. Over 3,000 human vessels had just entered the system. Not warships. Something else. "Show me," he ordered. The laser plasma displays flickered before resolving into a panoramic tactical overlay of the incoming armada. The War Council stared in frozen disbelief as the impossible took form. These were not military vessels, no sleek battle cruisers, no Fortress-class dreadnoughts bristling with advanced weaponry. What loomed in Dominion space were colony freighters, stripped-down asteroid haulers, repurposed refinery stations fused with crude armor plating. Commander Osric Vane's transmission cut through the stunned silence with a voice like cold steel dragging across stone. "Don't tell us your war plans." The War Council chamber fell deathly still. "Tell us where they keep their leaders." Vecton's soul had been alive for 2 centuries. He had studied the human species for over half of it. Every report, every intercepted transmission, every fractured glimpse into their history painted them as erratic, short-lived creatures prone to internal strife. He had never been afraid of them, until now. His third-in-command, Tavik Jorn, exhaled sharply, as if trying to rid himself of the suffocating weight pressing down on the chamber. This cannot be their actual fleet. "They're not warships," another tactician muttered. "No," Vectan agreed, "they're not." And that was the problem. The fleet didn't slow. It didn't ask permission. It moved with the force of inevitability, gliding into battle formation as if it had always belonged there. Tavik's yellowed eyes darted between readouts, analyzing the crude configurations of the human vessels. This is madness. Those are cargo haulers, not combat ships. Kordash Vel, the only Zenvar in the chamber who did not appear shocked, made a slow, deliberate gesture toward the displays. Not anymore. The Dominion officers turned their attention to the data feeds, watching in grim fascination as the human ships shifted, reassembled themselves in real time. Cargo bays unfolded into launch decks. Heavy industrial plating slid into defensive configurations. Refinery stations pivoted, revealing internal artillery arrays scavenged from decommissioned orbital cannons. Tavik's voice caught in his throat. They're converting their ships mid-flight. And they had done it in 72 hours. Vecton's secondary heart kicked harder as his mind struggled to reconcile the impossibility of what he was witnessing. This wasn't a military deployment. It was a mobilization of industry. Humanity hadn't sent its warships. They had sent everything. Across the Dominion lines, tactical AI units struggled to classify the newcomers. The system's combat processors, designed to analyze known enemy formations, churned through thousands of iterations, searching for an appropriate risk assessment. Nothing matched. There was no record of a civilization deploying oil tankers and processing stations as frontline assault craft. Vectan could almost hear the synthetic confusion radiating from the Dominion war network. But the Varkari? The Varkari didn't need tactical assessments. They saw new prey. The first Varkari assault wings roared into the system, streamlined, hardened for battle, their formations perfect. A nightmare of bio-augmented efficiency. They saw no military-grade weaponry on the human vessels. They detected no reinforced shielding. They engaged immediately. The first salvo of plasma lances ripped toward the human ships, a volley designed to shatter hulls and scatter survivors into the void. It should have crippled them. It didn't, because the hulls didn't break. They absorbed. Molten slag rolled down reinforced industrial plating, dispersing along the human vessel's modular armor layers. The Dominion officers watched, frozen, as entire sections of human ships burned away, only for backup plating to shift forward and replace them. Aboard the lead human command vessel, the UECV Tyrannus, Osric Vane stood at the heart of his bridge, unflinching as the ship quaked from incoming fire. Structural damage across 3 decks, Dorian Cass reported, his tone more amused than alarmed. Osric barely glanced up. And Cass flicked a command across his heads-up display. Redundant hull plating compensating. Estimated operational loss? 3%. The bridge hummed with quiet amusement. Osric allowed the smallest hint of a smile. 3%. He turned his gaze toward the tactical overlay, where the Varkari fleet had slowed, hesitated. They had realized their mistake. Osric gestured toward the forward assault units. Send them our condolences. Cass activated the firing sequence. The entire front line of human ships responded as one, and then the void caught fire. Zenvar War Council watched the first counter-volley unfold. Tavik gripped the railing as the human ships retaliated, not with concentrated, precision-based targeting, but with overwhelming, chaotic ferocity. Where Varkari ships moved with cold, insectoid discipline, humanity fought like a bar fight in deep space. Torpedoes launched from what should have been grain silos. Industrial lasers, normally used for asteroid mining, sliced through enemy formations like executioners' blades. Drone swarms spilled from converted transport bays, spiraling through the fray with a kind of reckless ingenuity that no Dominion strategist could have anticipated. The Varkari reacted, but they reacted too late. Their battle algorithms expected coordinated tactics. They got pure, unfiltered chaos. Across the Dominion's command sector, an uneasy silence fell. Zenvar tacticians grappled with the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. It defied every established rule of warfare. Tavik finally spoke, his voice hollow. "They're not fighting this war. They're replacing it." Aboard the Varkari High Nest, War Master Skorvek Nal watched the feed from his personal war chamber. The initial reports had suggested an unremarkable force, a species of bipeds using outdated engines and primitive construction methods. Yet the initial assault had collapsed. Now, Skorvek observed something infinitely worse. The humans weren't fighting to hold a front. They weren't following predictable tactical doctrine. They were redefining the battlefield entirely. For the first time in centuries, Skorvek felt something foreign stir at the edges of his neural lattice, a creeping, unspoken realization. The hunt had turned. Varkari strongholds had names that promised endurance, monikers spoken with reverence by those who manned them, and dread by those who sought to breach them. The bastion line was no exception. It had held the tide of war for decades, a wall of fortress worlds, orbital cannons, and war stations tethered by automated response networks. The Dominion's most fortified sector, the last true buffer before the core systems fell. It took generations of Zenvar sacrifice to maintain it. Humanity shattered it in 37 minutes. Status report. Admiral Vecton's soul didn't look away from the tactical projections glowing in front of him, the stark red signatures of the Varkari advance pressing against the last standing bulwark of the Dominion. This was the threshold. If the bastion line fell, so did everything else. "We've scrambled all remaining fleets to reinforce the sector," General Tavik Jorn replied, his mandibles grinding together in restless unease. "But it won't hold. We barely had time to restructure defensive positions after—" The screen flickered. More data. More bad news. Vecton exhaled through his secondary lungs, shoulders rigid. "Say it." Jorn hesitated. "Say it." "They're deploying." Not the Varkari. The humans. Across the system, human vessels moved. Not in formations that made sense, not with the predictable discipline of Dominion legions or the unified swarm of Varkari assaults. Their ships broke apart, splitting into dozens of smaller tactical units that disregarded every standard engagement protocol in the history of warfare. Varkari strategists analyzed the movement patterns as erratic, uncontrolled. It wasn't. It was designed madness. Deep inside the UECV Tyrannus, Dr. Lennox Jair adjusted his glasses and grinned at the mess unfolding across his laser plasma display. "I think they're starting to panic." Strategist Dorian Cass folded his arms, watching the streams of corrupted data spewing through the Varkari battle network. "We just fed their war algorithms 5 terabytes of outdated sitcoms, advertising jingles, and—" He glanced at the screen, raising an eyebrow. "I don't even know what that is." "It's a public domain cartoon from 1954, Jair said cheerfully. Cass frowned. "Why?" Jair tapped at his console. "Because the Varkari AI tried to auto-translate all of it simultaneously while adjusting for cultural relevance, and now half their fleet thinks, 'Leave it to Beaver' is a hostile fleet maneuver." Cass blinked. Then he laughed. "You're insane." "No," Jair corrected. "They are. We just make sure they don't know it yet." The first Varkari salvos ripped toward the human fleet. They didn't miss. That was never the problem. Impact flares glowed across the hulls of the human ships, raking through hastily reinforced plating, melting through outer layers of modular defenses. And yet, the ships did not break. They absorbed. Plasma fire sloughed over crude plating that was never meant to be military grade. Entire ship sections crumpled inward, bulkheads peeling away into the dark. And still, they advanced. Aboard the Tyrannus, Cass studied the impact readouts. "We're losing armor at a rate of 2% per second. Osric Vane barely glanced at him. "And?" Cass smirked. Plating rotation engaged, damage negligible. The damaged section slid back, replaced by redundant layers of scrap-reinforced hull. Humanity hadn't built its fleet to last. They'd built it to outlast. The bastion line's automated defenses locked onto the advancing human ships. Targeting systems whirred through calculations, cycling through countermeasures, countermeasures, risk assessments, and then they stopped. Dominion tacticians stared in silent disbelief as the laser plasma displays flickered, overloaded by a tidal wave of corrupted information. "What the hell is happening?" Tavik growled, his exo-limbs twitching as the tactical feeds descended into chaos. Jair's voice crackled through the secured channel. "We made them think like us." Vecton's mandibles clicked sharply in confusion. "Explain." "Their battle AI isn't designed for this kind of cognitive dissonance. We injected enough conflicting logic loops into their network that now half their fleet believes they're already victorious and are waiting for debriefing." Tavik stared at the screen, unblinking, as Varkari ships drifted off course, their maneuvering thrusters misfiring, their formation collapsing. Cass exhaled in mild admiration. "They're actually tripping over themselves." Jair adjusted his glasses. "Told you." Varkari command nodes scrambled to override the errors. It was too late. Battle directives snapped back online in fractured sections. Some ships re-engaged. Others continued broadcasting tactical assessments from battles that had not yet taken place. And some fired on their own fleets. Vectan's hands curled into fists. The unbreakable bastion line, the strongest defensive wall in Dominion history, was coming apart before his eyes. 37 minutes. That's how long it took. Cass folded his arms, nodding toward the panicked Dominion officers. "We good?" Osric tilted his head slightly, as if considering. Then, finally, he nodded. Cass flicked a command. Human artillery systems engaged. A wave of projectiles rained toward the remaining Varkari fleets. Not precision shots, not targeted destruction, just a raw, overwhelming barrage. Varkari ships, still scrambling to recover from their own internal collapse, couldn't compensate. The bastion line was gone. Vectan leaned forward, staring at the display in quiet horror. It was over. And it hadn't even been a battle. It had been an execution. Tavik Jorn exhaled. His voice was hollow. They never even fired a real shot. Aboard the Taranis, Osric Vane gave the order. "Advance!" The Dominion watched in stunned silence as the human fleet surged forward, pushing into now open Varkari space. They had breached the final wall, and the war had only just begun. The bastion line had crumbled, a fortress reduced to drifting wreckage and shattered defenses. Varkari warships reeled in confusion, their battle AI still tangled in corrupted data loops that refused to align with reality. For the first time in the war, the swarm hesitated. Then, the impossible happened. The human fleet turned away. Aboard the Dominion command station, the War Council erupted in disbelief. Vectan Sol's second-in-command, Tavik Jorn, slammed a fist against the control panel, mandibles flaring. "They're pulling back! They've breached the line and they're retreating?" Across the chamber, laser plasma displays tracked the human ships as they disengaged, veering away from the open wound they had carved into Varkari space. Tactician Prime Kordash Vel watched in silence, his multiple eyes flicking over the data streams, studying the retreat with unsettling calm. "They're not running," he said. Vectan's gaze narrowed. "Then what the hell are they doing?" The Varkari high nest burned with tension. War Master Skorvek Nal stood within the throne chamber, his neural lattice pulsing as battle reports streamed into his consciousness. He had been alive for 4 centuries, had waged war before his limbs had fully hardened in the birthing pools. He had seen every tactic, every deception. This was something else. "Probability assessment," he ordered. The chamber's hive mind intelligence pulsed with a response. 97.2% probability. Human forces are retreating. The remaining 2.8% was statistical noise, irrelevant. Skorvek's 4 upper limbs curled in thought. The humans had not fought like warriors. They had fought like something worse. And now they were leaving? It was an insult beyond reason. Skorvek flexed his clawed appendages, his mandibles scraping together. They think they have already won. The rage within the swarm pulsed through the hive network, a hunger amplified by wounded pride. That could not be allowed. His command sent ripples through the hegemony war machine. All forces! Pursue! Varkari war fleets surged forward. The black void of space ignited as thousands of ships raced after the retreating human vessels, battle formations tightening, engines burning hot as they prepared for the killing blow. Their mandibles ached for the slaughter. They never saw the trap. Aboard the UECV Tyrannus, Osric Vane stood in eerie stillness. The ship shuddered faintly as automated systems reconfigured battle formations, human fleet markers shifting position on the heads-up displays. The trap was closing. Dorian Cass exhaled slowly, arms folded. They took the bait. Osric tilted his head slightly, watching as the Varkari ships funneled into the kill zone, blind to the reality unraveling around them. The silence of waiting stretched, the calm before the blade fell. Then Osric Vane spoke. "We're not here to fight them," he said. Cass tapped the targeting interface. Thousands of drones lurked in the dark, waiting. "Then what are we here to do?" Osric's expression was unreadable. "Bury them." The moment the last Varkari ship breached the designated coordinates, the trap triggered. Automated distress signals flared from deep within the sector, mimicking the Dominion's last strongholds. The Varkari battle swarm instinctively moved to flank, drawn toward the perceived weakness. They never noticed the absence of human ships on the outer perimeters, never saw the silent drones waiting beyond their sensor range, lying dormant in deep space gravity wells, until it was too late. The drones activated simultaneously, executing pinpoint antimatter jumps into the Varkari fleet's formation. It wasn't an explosion, it was a collapse. Space itself buckled as gravity ruptures ignited in the wake of the detonations, severing fleet cohesion in a way no direct assault ever could. Hundreds of ships vanished in an instant, swallowed by cascading chain reactions that ripped through their ranks. For the first time in recorded history, the Varkari swarm fractured. Ships veered into one another, fire control systems overwhelmed by the sudden fragmentation of their formations. Then, the swarm's genetic flaw activated. The Varkari were incapable of retreat. Hardwired into their genetic code, their battle physiology forbade withdrawal. Without order, they continued forward, crashing into the wreckage of their own destroyed fleets, unable to stop, unable to reform, unable to break away. The kill box tightened. Aboard the Tyrannus, the war room fell silent. Osric watched as the enemy forces unraveled, their strength becoming their weakness. Zenvar officers stood behind him, stiff with disbelief. Tavik Jorn's mandibles clicked softly, his throat dry. "I don't understand." Osric finally looked at him. "You never needed to win this war." Vectan's voice was quiet, realization sinking deep into his bones. "You only needed them to lose it." Osric nodded. "Exactly." The last remnants of the Varkari fleet buckled under their own inertia, their broken formations spiraling further into disarray. The War Council stared at the unfolding collapse. Tavik took a slow breath. "This is," Osric finished for him, "a graveyard." On the Varkari high nest, Skorvek Nal felt the swarm breaking. The battlefield data screamed through his neural lattice, thousands of ships lost in a chain reaction that should not have been possible. His mind raced through probability calculations, searching for an exit, a contingency, a way out. There was none. For the first time in 400 years of war, he knew fear. The humans had not come to fight them. They had come to extinguish them. As the last of the Varkari war fleets collapsed, humanity continued forward. Their ships moved without hesitation, their strategy never about holding ground, never about claiming territory. They weren't interested in victory. They were interested in what came after it. The war was no longer a question of if. It was only a matter of time. The ground beneath Fortress Prime trembled as the first wave of drop pods ripped through the atmosphere, fire-lit streaks carving their descent toward the killing fields below. Captain Eric Kasor locked his combat harness as the pod's restraints hissed, tightening around his frame. The interior shook violently, turbulence rattling the bulkheads as the descent thrusters fought against planetary gravity. Across from him, his fire team sat silent. Not out of fear, but focus. The kind of stillness that only came before impact. 5 seconds. Their pilot's voice crackled through comms. Kasor glanced at his tactical display, watching the orbital feed in real time. The landscape below was hell incarnate. A Varkari stronghold, surrounded by living trenches of bio-walls, chitinous barriers grown, not built. Pulsing, alien fortifications stretched for miles, their surface glowing with defensive spore emissions meant to dissolve anything that wasn't Varkari. Between those defenses, thousands of enemy soldiers waited. Each one stood 3 meters tall, their exoskeletal plating capable of withstanding vacuum, direct concussive force, even sustained energy fire. Each one was born for war. They should have been unstoppable. Kasor grinned. Except humans fought dirty. The drop pods struck the ground with concussive force, bursting open like pressure-sealed coffins. Kasor's boots slammed against the earth as he vaulted from the wreckage, weapon raised, the immediate landscape nothing but chaos and fire. The Varkari were already moving, their synchronized charge shaking the soil, each step a brutal, crushing force. They rushed the human position with unbroken precision, their quad-limbed movement a blur of muscle and exoskeletal plating, weapons emitting pulses of sonic concussions meant to rupture internal organs on impact. Kasor never stopped running. "Deploy disruptors!" he barked. The first volley of canisters arced through the air, twisting mid-flight as their chemical payload dispersed. The battlefield shifted instantly. A pale fog bled outward, curling through the air in thick tendrils. It wasn't poison. It didn't need to be. The Varkari moved like a hive, functioned like a hive. But for the first time in their history, they experienced isolation. The chemical mist disrupted their neural links, severing the perfect synchronization they relied on. They stumbled mid-charge, the once cohesive formation breaking apart, their battle network flickering with panicked interference. Kasor's HUD pulsed. "They're disoriented. Hit them now." Flash rounds erupted from the human side. They weren't designed to blind eyes. They were designed to blind senses. Varkari sight was secondary to their echolocation. Their pheromone communication systems wired directly into their nervous responses. The flashbangs weren't light-based. They were sound-based, a frequency that triggered their hive instincts into overdrive, forcing them to process every single input as a simultaneous attack. In the span of 3 seconds, the battlefield dissolved into pure chaos. A Zenvar observer drone captured the unfolding battle, broadcasting the impossible sight back to the Dominion's War Council. Vecton's soul watched in silent horror. "This isn't war," Tavik muttered. "It's—" "A message," Kordash finished. The Varkari responded the only way they knew how, through instinct. Their genetic doctrine had no protocol for retreat. Instead, they turned on their wounded, putting them down in quick, brutal executions. Kasor watched it happen through his scope, exhaling slowly. His Marines weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming to wound. Across the field, a wounded Varkari soldier writhed, one of its lower limbs shredded by human rifle fire. Its nearest squad mate did not stop to assist. It raised its weapon and fired. Kasor's jaw set. "Make them do it again!" The Zenvar War Council remained silent as the footage played on. The humans were shooting to injure, not to kill, because the Varkari could not leave wounded behind, and that meant forcing them to execute their own. Vektan's secondary heart shuddered against his ribcage. Tavik exhaled sharply. "We thought they were unpredictable," he murmured. Kordash's mandibles clicked once, sharp as a blade being drawn. "We thought wrong." On the battlefield, the Varkari broke, not because they were outgunned, not because they were outmatched, but because they had never known what it was to hesitate, and humanity had made them learn. Kasor stepped forward, the air thick with the scent of burning compounds, the distant howls of something old breaking apart. The Varkari had never experienced psychological warfare, until now. The Zenvar Council watched as the remaining Varkari forces collapsed. It wasn't a retreat. It was an extinction. Vektan's soul felt the war shift. The Varkari were not afraid of death. But now? They were afraid of what came before it. Humanity had broken the unbreakable species, and the galaxy would never be the same. Dr. Lennox Jare's fingers moved like a concert pianist across the console, his expression disturbingly calm as he wove destruction into lines of code. The laser plasma display before him was a flood of cascading data, fractured Varkari encryption protocols unraveling like loose thread beneath his team's invasive scripts. "They're still resisting," a technician muttered, watching as Varkari firewalls adapted, reconfiguring in real time. Lennox barely glanced up. "Not for long." His voice held no bravado, only certainty. The Varkari war machine had always been perfect. For centuries, their hive mind functioned without error, their AI-driven battle networks orchestrating war at a scale beyond comprehension. But they had never fought an enemy like humanity, never encountered minds willing to break the rules of engagement, not through superior firepower, but through pure, unrestricted chaos. And Lennox Jare had found their flaw. "Injecting the loop," Lennox announced, his tone devoid of triumph. The display pulsed as the first line of false data slid into the Varkari neural lattice, a single ripple spreading across an ocean of interwoven consciousness. From a tactical perspective, it was nothing. Just a harmless combat report buried deep within their war logs. A status update, a simple, irrefutable truth. They had already won the war. Across the battlefield, Varkari ships began to slow. Battle cruisers, once locked in furious engagements, simply drifted. Fighter squadrons ceased their evasive maneuvers, adjusting into standard post-battle formations. One by one, entire fleet segments disengaged from combat, their AI ceasing all offensive directives. The Varkari believed they had already won. They were waiting for debriefing. On board the Varkari High Nest, War Master Skorvek Nal's neural lattice burned with 1,000 conflicting alarms. Data reports blurred and restructured before his eyes, status logs cycling through battle updates that should not exist, victory reports, casualty tallies, not of his enemies, but of his own forces. His mandibles flared open in sudden horror. "Who issued this?" No answer came. Because it had not been issued. It had simply become true. The hive mind struggled against the corruption, tendrils of its consciousness coiling and constricting in panic. But truth, once accepted, is hard to undo. Ships powered down, their weapons ceasing fire mid-volley. Strategic AI clusters halted counterattacks, redirecting their efforts toward preparing for an after-action report that had never been ordered. Even the ground forces hesitated, their instinctual coordination wavering under the sudden disruption. For the first time in history, the swarm was confused. And then, it shattered. Aboard the Tyrannus, Dorian Cass exhaled a low whistle. "They're breaking," he said, watching thousands of enemy ships flicker out of combat mode. Lennox leaned back from the console, stretching his hands. "Told you." Cass shook his head. "You just convinced a species that's never surrendered to do it voluntarily." Lennox adjusted his glasses. "They didn't surrender," he corrected. "They just don't realize they should still be fighting." War Master Skorvek Nal's breath came shallow, his neural lattice spasming under the weight of the failing connection. The hive mind was dissolving, fragmented threads of communication breaking apart like a crumbling dam. He had spent centuries wielding absolute control over his forces. And now, he was alone. Across the battlefield, Varkari pilots and soldiers experienced something they had never known before. Individual thought. The hive mind that had dictated their every action was gone, leaving behind only raw, unfiltered sentience. They looked around in confusion, seeing their comrades not as extensions of themselves, but as other beings. Not a swarm. Just a battlefield of frightened individuals trapped in bodies designed for war. Aboard the Dominion War Council, Vectan Sol watched in silent horror. This is genocide." Tavik Jorn shook his head. "No." He swallowed hard. "This is worse." On the high nest, Skorvek Nal's final defense shattered. His battle AI tried to reconstruct its command systems, to override the false data infecting its core. It failed, and in its death throes, it broadcasted its last-ditch emergency failsafe. A location ping, his location, to every human vessel in range. On the Tyrannus, Cass blinked at his readout. "That's convenient." Osric Vane's expression did not change. "Mark it." Lennox tilted his head, watching the data feed. "Do we even need to?" "They just told us where their god lives," Cass muttered. Osric's eyes flickered over the transmission, reading it once before looking back at the display of the dying fleet. The war was over. But Skorvek Nal was not yet dead. Osric nodded once. "Then let's correct that." The Varkari High Nest loomed ahead, an immense living fortress, its outer walls pulsing with the slow rhythm of something almost alive. It was a city, a command center, a final bastion for the hegemony's ruling class, and the last stronghold of a species that had never known defeat. Until now. The human fleet hung in the darkness beyond the nest, silent and waiting. They had no need for bombardment. This was not a battle. It was an execution. Inside the Tyrannus command chamber, Osric Vane studied the tactical feed. His officers were quiet, focused, unmoving, watching as the Varkari fleet continued to fragment. The battle was over, but the war had not yet ended. Osric glanced at Dorian Cass, who was leaning against the communications console, arms folded, expression unreadable. "Do it." Cass nodded once and activated the transmission. A message rolled out across every known frequency, broadcasting to the High Nest, to the Dominion, to anyone left who still thought the war could be salvaged. "You have 1 hour to surrender, or we activate Phase 2. Inside the High Nest, Overlord Zalvareth's neural lattice flared with unfiltered panic. Every war calculation, every strategic assessment, every probability model spiraled into the same answer. There was no victory. He stared at the data feeds, his breath shallow, watching as the hive's remaining fleets powered down one by one, as if some unseen force had already decided the outcome. This wasn't defeat. It was obliteration waiting to be confirmed. His limbs tightened involuntarily, the instinct to fight warring against the cold logic of survival. 1 hour. That was all the time he had to decide whether the Varkari existed tomorrow or became another forgotten empire swallowed by history. Inside the Tyrannus, Lennox Jair exhaled a quiet breath. Cass looked over. "How long before they realize Phase 2 doesn't exist?" Lennox's fingers moved across his display, cycling through Varkari data collapses, security breaches, fragmented hive communications. "They won't," he said, "because they don't know what it is." Cass frowned. "It's a bluff." Osric's expression didn't change. "It doesn't matter." Cass narrowed his eyes. "It matters if they call it." "They won't." Osric gestured to the heads-up display, where the last Varkari warfleet sat in eerie silence, their battle instincts overridden by pure uncertainty. "They have nothing left. The only thing keeping them together is fear." Lennox nodded. "And fear is all they need." Inside the high nest, Zalvareth's mind raced. Phase 2. What was Phase 2? Humanity had not needed any phases up until now. They had not fought this war like the Dominion. They had not engaged in slow, drawn-out conflicts like the hegemony. They had simply ended things. And now they were offering a choice, which meant there was something worse than what had already happened. Zalvareth's claws tightened against the control panel, his exoskeletal ridges twitching involuntarily. He looked at the data projections. The hive mind collapses, the neural disruptions, the battle formations left in complete ruin. 52 minutes remained. He knew the only logical choice, and yet his genetic conditioning fought against it, screaming in protest, warning him that surrender was antithetical to existence. But so was extinction. Inside the Tyrannus, the countdown ticked lower. Lennox tapped a fresh data stream. "They're analyzing every possible outcome. Their AI keeps running models that all lead to the same conclusion." Cass leaned in. "And?" Lennox smiled faintly. "They don't survive in any of them." 40 minutes. Inside the high nest, Zalvareth watched the war machine he had once commanded fall apart piece by piece. The hive noise had faded, leaving only individual voices where a singular consciousness had once reigned. His people were afraid. For the first time in their history, they were afraid. 30 minutes. Inside the Zenvar war chamber, Vectan's soul leaned forward, watching the tactical display. Kordash Vel's mandibles clicked together once. "They won't resist." Tavik Jorn let out a slow breath. "You're sure?" Kordash gestured toward the Varkari fleet, frozen and unresponsive. "The Varkari have never experienced true war," he said. "They were born into a battle they always assumed they would win." His tone darkened. "Until now." 15 minutes. Inside the high nest, Zalvareth's neural network buzzed with transmission requests. His commanders, his surviving officers, all waiting for an answer. The weight of the hegemony pressed down on him, the fate of an empire demanding resolution. 10 minutes. Zalvareth exhaled. He reached toward the primary transmission relay. He had ruled long enough to understand when something was inevitable. He would not allow his species to be remembered only in extinction records. With a slow, deliberate motion, he activated the emergency broadcast beacon, and he spoke. Inside the Tyrannus, Lennox's console flashed. "Incoming transmission." Cass exhaled. "Here it comes." Osric's expression didn't shift. The voice of Overlord Zalvareth filled the channel. "This is the hegemony. We surrender." Silence. Not relief, not celebration, just silence. Osric reached forward and cut the transmission. Then he turned to his crew. "It's done." Cass rubbed his jaw. "Just like that?" Osric met his gaze. "It was always going to end this way." Inside the Zenvar war chamber, Vectan's soul exhaled. He felt no satisfaction, only the deep, quiet understanding that the galaxy had changed. Kordash Vel nodded once. "It's over." Vectan looked at the hushed battle maps, at the aftermath of an empire that had collapsed in 5 hours. "No," he said, "it's just beginning." And in the darkness of space, where once a war had raged for centuries, there was now only silence. The galaxy had new rulers, and everyone knew it. The war was over. The galaxy knew it the moment the last transmission from the Varkari high nest went silent. There was no treaty, no formal ceremony, no prolonged negotiations. There was only a single message, delivered without embellishment, broadcasted across every remaining Dominion and Varkari channel. This is the hegemony. We surrender. A sentence that had never been spoken before, and it had taken humans 5 hours to make it happen. Inside the Zenvar war chamber, Admiral Vecton Sol stared at the laser plasma display, watching the battlefield reports shift from real-time combat logs to casualty assessments. He did not feel relief. He did not feel victory. He felt a deep, cold understanding that the balance of power in the galaxy had changed forever. Behind him, Tavik Jorn exhaled sharply, gripping the console as if grounding himself in reality. "I keep thinking," Tavik murmured, voice uneven, "that at some point they would have stopped." "They never had to," Kordash Vel responded, his voice absent of emotion. "The Varkari were never an opponent, just an obstacle to remove." Vecton's mandibles flexed as he processed the data scrolling before him. "We need to prepare for negotiations." Tavik let out a short, humorless breath. "Negotiations? With them?" "Yes." Silence. Then, Kordash, for the first time, looked truly unsettled. "Do you honestly believe humanity is here to negotiate?" Inside the Tyrannus, Osric Vane watched as the last of the Varkari war machine collapsed. Ships drifted without power, some still locked in corrupted standby cycles, believing a war had ended that, in reality, had never needed to happen. Across the bridge, Dorian Cass sat with his arms folded, staring at the communications feed. "They're waiting," Cass muttered. Osric said nothing, because he knew what the rest of the galaxy was thinking, that Earth would make its demands, that the Terran fleet, now the most feared force in the known universe, would claim the spoils of war, that humanity would do what every empire in history had done before them. The Zenvar waited. The surviving Varkari waited. The entire galactic order waited. And so, Osric gave them an answer. Humanity's demand was transmitted across every channel, not just to the Dominion, not just to the hegemony, to everyone, to every species that had watched this war unfold, to every empire that had assumed humans were a footnote in history rather than the authors of its next chapter. And when the message came, it wasn't what anyone expected. "Leave us alone." Vecton Sol's breath caught in his chest. That was it? No territorial claims, no forced reparations, no demand for technological supremacy, nothing, just isolation, just a warning. Tavik's throat worked, as if trying to speak and failing. "They're walking away." Vecton barely heard him, because his mind was somewhere else. He had spent centuries watching humanity, studying their history, their aggression, their ingenuity, their unchecked chaos. And it was only now, standing in the aftermath of a war they had ended like a simple logistical exercise, that he realized humanity had never been an empire, because they had never needed to be. Inside the Tyrannus, Lennox Jair shut down his terminal, stretching as if he had just completed another routine assignment. Cass watched him. "That's it?" Lennox shrugged. "They expected us to ask for something. That was their mistake." Cass let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "We just ended a war in 5 hours, and all we want is to be left alone." Osric finally turned to face him. His expression was unreadable. "Do you really think that's a request?" Cass fell silent. Because it wasn't. It was a statement. A final warning. A declaration that Earth had no interest in ruling the stars. But if pushed, they would return. 3 weeks later, the Dominion Intelligence Council convened for an emergency session. The meeting was classified at the highest level. The sole topic? Humanity. Every species in recorded history had been categorized under Dominion threat assessments. The Varkari had once been listed as a level 8 hostile civilization, until humans ended them in hours. Now, a new classification was needed, a designation not used in Dominion history. The final entry was recorded into official archives by Admiral Vectan Sol himself. Do not provoke under any circumstances. In the far reaches of the galaxy, beyond the Dominion's most distant borders, Earth returned to silence. Their fleets vanished back into the void. Their war machines shut down. Their people went home. And the galaxy, for the first time in its history, understood what it meant to fear a species that did not desire power, but only the assurance that they would never be threatened again. Because humanity didn't fight wars. They ended them. And the next one would not take 5 hours. It would take minutes, and everyone knew it.